The fall of a Space Marine chapter is not simply a matter of banners burned or armor stripped of heraldry. It is a wound in the Imperium's very memory, a fracture in the story of loyalty and faith. When the proud brothers of a chapter turn their blades inward, the galaxy does not forget it watches. It listens, and it questions what such betrayal means for every oath sworn to the Emperor. What do Loyalists see? What do they whisper when a chapter once honored among them begins to rot from within? That is the path we follow now. Before we continue deeper into this tale, if you find yourself drawn to these stories of faith tested and loyalty broken, consider lending your support. Like, share, and subscribe, so that more voices may hear these echoes of the Imperium. The battlefield was alive with soundless fire burning through the haze, the thunder of artillery rolling across mud-choked trenches, and the shouts of commanders urging men to hold their lines. To an untrained eye, the clash appeared seamless, the Emperor's warriors advancing in unity against the Xenos threat. But among those who had fought beside the Astartes for years, who had trusted in their rhythm as one trusts in the beating of one's own heart, something subtle was missing. Brother Captain Alaric of the Lions of Helios raised his power sword high, the blade crackling with caged lightning, and yet he did not bring it down at once. The Astra Militarum officers waiting for the signal looked upward, expecting the strike that would mark the charge. Instead, there was only a pause, barely a handful of seconds, but long enough to draw unease. In war, hesitation is a language. It speaks volumes, even when no words pass, and that hesitation was the first note in a song no one wished to hear. The battle raged on, and the lions fought with their usual brutality, their bolters roaring in disciplined cadence. Yet the Loyalists beside them could not shake the memory of that pause. Why had the captain delayed? The enemy had not faltered. The terrain offered no unseen danger. To the guardsmen who marched in faith, such a delay was small, perhaps irrelevant. But to the commissar stationed at their flank, to the chaplain of another chapter overseeing the battle in grim silence, it was as if a note had gone flat in a sacred hymn. Later, when the enemy had been driven back and the banners of victory raised above the ruins, the rituals began. Victory prayers were to be offered, hymns sung, genocide honored with solemn rites. It was here, in the hush that followed, that the next fracture appeared. The lions gathered in formation, their armor still stained with the ichor of the slain. They knelt as one before their chaplain, who raised his crozius high. Yet, when the litany rose, it carried no weight. Words were spoken, yes, but they lacked the iron conviction that once seemed to shake the air itself. Loyalists who had prayed beside them before noticed the difference instantly. The Emperor's name sounded like a duty mouthed, not a fire burning. A single guardsman whispered it to his fellow in the shadow of the ruins. They pray like men who doubt. That whisper, though swiftly silenced by a commissar's glare, was enough. For in the Imperium, faith is not merely a shield, it is the only shield. And when faith falters, even slightly, it leaves a wound that no armor can cover. In the days that followed, the cracks widened, though they were not yet open betrayals. Orders given late, vox transmissions where the voice seemed colder, stripped of familiar fur. The Lions of Helios had always marched with fire, their every step a proclamation of loyalty to the throne. Now, their tread was heavy, functional, absent of the music Loyalists expected. None spoke of it openly, but all felt it. The chaplain of the Iron Talons, sent to oversee the campaign, was among the first to confront the silence. He watched them as they prepared their war gear, as they stood in vigil before battle. He noted the subtle shifts, the aquila traced upon breastplates slower than before, the murmured prayers shortened, unfinished. He reported these things in coded vox to his own chapter, though he couched his words in care. To accuse a brother chapter was to risk unleashing suspicion that could fracture an entire crusade, but to remain silent was worse. His words recorded one phrase again and again: devotion without fire, ritual without spirit. On the front lines, Loyalist guardsmen grew uneasy. The lions fought bravely still, their bolters cutting swaths through the enemy. But they fought like machines, not like angels of vengeance. To some, this seemed efficiency. To others, it was the death of something far greater. For what is an Astartes without his faith? What is a blade without the hand that wields it with purpose? The fracture widened in moments too small for record. A sergeant of the Lions was asked by a guardsman if the Emperor had smiled upon the day's victory. The sergeant gave no answer, only a tight nod before turning away. Another Marine, once known for reciting litanies mid-battle, fought in silence, his vox-grill carrying no prayer. Such details, inconsequential to those not attuned, became heavy weights for those who watched. A commissar wrote in his private log, "It is not their strength that fades, it is their fire. And without fire, what remains?" Whispers grew in the barracks. Some guardsmen claimed to have seen a lion remove his helmet during prayer, eyes unfocused, lips unmoving. Others swore they heard voices on the vox, not chanting hymns, but muttering words in languages unknown. Perhaps exaggerations, perhaps the fever of paranoia that always clings to war. But in the Imperium, rumor itself is a weapon, and suspicion once birthed cannot be slain so easily. The first crack in the shield was not blood, it was silence. Silence where faith should thunder, silence where devotion should blaze. Those who witnessed it carried unease like a contagion. They did not yet name it heresy. They did not yet dare to imagine that the lions of Helios could fall from grace. But in their hearts, Loyalists knew they had seen the moment a chapter began to lean away from the throne, and they understood, though they could not say it, that once the first crack appears, the shield will never be whole again. It began not with words spoken aloud, but with the absence of eyes, meeting eyes. In the Imperium, oaths are not mere utterances, they are lifeblood. When a sergeant kneels before his captain, when a line of Astartes speaks their vow as one, their voices form more than sound, they bind themselves to eternity. And yet, on that day, when the oath was repeated before the banners of the Lions of Helios, a sergeant's gaze faltered. His head dipped at the appointed moment, but his eyes slid away from the Imperial Aquila. No one else moved. No one else broke rhythm. But that single moment was noticed. The chaplain saw it. The guardsmen near enough to glimpse it carried it away in whispers, and the Loyalists beside them felt their hearts constrict. In the rigid discipline of the Adeptus Astartes, every gesture is deliberate. There is no casual movement, no careless oversight. To look away during an oath is no accident. It is a declaration, silent, yet louder than any heretic's shout. The chaplain of the Lions thundered his litanies to cover it. His crozius raised high, sparks of sanctified light flickering from its head. But even his voice betrayed him. There was no fire behind the words, no living conviction. He spoke the syllables, yes, but they fell flat. The brothers responded out of habit, not zeal. Those who stood near felt it in their bones. The commissar who had marched with 3 different chapters knew the cadence of faith, and this was not it. The Iron Talon's chaplain, still watching with cold suspicion, heard the hollow ring. The guardsmen who dared not speak aloud felt their stomachs twist. Faith in the Imperium is not measured only in victories or prayers spoken. It is measured in the unbroken certainty of warriors who embody it. And here, certainty cracked like a marble statue under pressure. The sergeant himself, his name lost to record, erased when the chapter's shame was finally struck from history, offered no explanation. He stood as if nothing had happened, armor gleaming, bolt gun at his side, ready for war. Yet those who had seen his eyes knew they would never forget it. It was not defiance they had glimpsed, it was doubt. And doubt in an Astartes is more dangerous than defiance, for defiance can be slain, but doubt lingers. It spreads. It stains everything it touches. Afterward, among the barracks of the Loyal Astra Militarum, rumors swelled. Guardsmen spoke quietly over rations, recounting how the lions seemed distant even when victorious. One recalled the chaplain's voice cracking. Another swore he saw an Astartes hesitate before striking an enemy already broken. These were not men unaccustomed to fear. They had seen worlds burn, had fought beside other chapters without flinching. But what unsettled them now was not the enemy. It was the sense that their guardians, their angels, were shadows of what they once were. Even within the lions themselves, fractures began to surface. Brothers, who once clasped gauntlets after victory, now walked past one another in silence. Sergeants drilled their squads with the same ruthless efficiency. But camaraderie had dimmed, replaced with something unspoken. A captain gave orders with perfect clarity, yet none repeated them with the fervor of true devotion. It was as though a fire had been banked, reduced to embers glowing faintly under ash. And so the lions fought on. Their bolters still roared. Their chainswords still carved the flesh of Xenos and heretic alike. To those who had never seen them before, they seemed unstoppable. To those who had marched beside them in years past, however, something essential had shifted. Every oath, every prayer, every litany was now measured not in its presence, but in its lack. The Loyalists felt it, like a missing drumbeat in the rhythm of war. One guardsman, who survived the campaigns only to die later in another theater, described it in his journal. It was as if they had already turned their faces away, though their bodies still stood beside us. They looked at us, but not at us. They prayed, but not to him. They swore oaths, but not with their souls. And once you see that in a brother's eyes, you cannot unsee it. The brother who looked away did not fall alone. His doubt became a mirror. Others saw it, and whether they admitted it or not, they carried the image within them. Faith is fragile when cracks appear, and in that fragility, Loyalists found themselves trapped, unable to act, unable to accuse, yet unable to forget. They stood beside warriors of the Emperor, who no longer seemed to look toward his throne, but into some shadow only they could see. The unease became a constant companion. Every battle after was colored by it. Every oath spoken was listened to, not for what was said, but for the tremor in what was unsaid. And though no blade had yet been raised in betrayal, the Loyalists knew in their bones that the path had already begun. For once a brother looks away during an oath, it is only a matter of time before he looks elsewhere entirely. The barracks of the Astra Militarum are never quiet. Even in rare moments of rest, there is always the scrape of boots on stone, the hiss of recycled air, the rasp of armor plates being cleaned. Yet among these familiar sounds, a new note had emerged, one so faint it was easy to miss unless one was listening for it. It was not the clash of bolters or the hammer of artillery. It was murmuring low, hushed, almost cautious, as though even the walls themselves were not to be trusted. The whispers moved like smoke, curling between bunks, carried on the breath of soldiers who had seen too much, felt too much, and feared to give it shape in full voice. The lions of Helios were still fighting with precision and strength. They still led charges, still raised their banners, still cut down the Emperor's foes with the savagery expected of the Adeptus Astartes. But something intangible clung to them. In the barracks, guardsmen swore they could hear it even through the bulkheads, their voices on the vox, clipped and stripped of their old fervor. It was not in what they said, but in what they did not say. Orders came without blessing. Affirmations came without zeal. Loyalists who had fought beside other chapters recognized it instantly. The cadence was wrong. The words were present, yet hollow, like a hymn sung without belief. One guardsman confided to another as they stripped their "When they speak, it feels like they've already left us." The comment earned a glare from a commissar, but even the commissar said nothing, for he, too, had noticed it. A chapter whose every word once rang with iron certainty now carried the flatness of duty alone. And in the Imperium, duty without faith is a corpse that still walks. The Vox lines amplified the unease between battles. Soldiers often tuned their sets to catch fragments of their Astartes guardians, snatches of orders, ritual affirmations, even the comforting rumble of their litanies before deployment. Once those sounds had been a source of strength, proof that the angels of the Emperor marched beside them. Now, the lines carried something colder. A captain's orders were delivered without passion. A chaplain's prayer sounded more like a rote recitation than a beacon of hope. The Loyalists who listened late at night whispered among themselves, "Do they even believe what they say anymore?" The barracks became a crucible of rumor. Some claimed to have heard words on the Vox that were not in Gothic at all. Syllables bent and stretched like static shaped into language. Others swore they had heard nothing unusual, but admitted that the silence between words seemed to last too long, as though the speaker were holding something back. A few went further, insisting they had seen lions gathered apart, speaking in tones too hushed for even enhanced hearing to catch. It was all rumor, all speculation, but in the Imperium, rumor is never harmless. It grows teeth. Within the fortress monastery itself, similar currents spread. Younger neophytes began to glance at their elders with uncertainty. Veterans carried themselves with the same iron discipline, but their words were sparse, their interactions colder. To look at them was to see warriors unchanged. To hear them was to sense distance. Their brothers were present, yet already far away. The loyal chaplain of the Iron Talons, still stationed among them, sharpened his suspicions with each passing day. He lingered near their rituals, listening to the weight of their words. He prowled the edges of their formations, watching for the subtle gestures that revealed more than open speech. He knew what he heard, though he dared not declare it outright. These Astartes were speaking as if to fulfill a requirement, not out of devotion. It was as though every syllable was weighed before release, as though meaning itself had been drained from their tongues. The guardsmen could not voice their dread openly, but their unease grew. Their whispers filled the barracks, carrying stories from one regiment to the next. Some said the lions no longer removed their armor in the sanctity of rest, keeping helmets sealed even when among brothers. Others insisted their eyes, when glimpsed through cracked lenses, were dull, absent of the fire that marked every true son of the Emperor. One tale spread quickly. A Vox officer claimed he had received an open channel transmission of a lion reciting what sounded like an oath, but the Emperor's name was missing. It was replaced by silence, a void where his title should have thundered. Whether true or born of paranoia, the effect was the same. Trust began to erode. Where once the Loyalists had marched with certainty, now they marched with glances over their shoulders. They no longer prayed with their Astartes, but apart from them, they no longer looked to their guardians with awe, but with quiet suspicion, and suspicion is its own kind of death. The lions themselves seemed oblivious or perhaps deliberately indifferent. They offered no explanations, no reassurances. They continued to fight with their brutal efficiency, but they gave nothing more. The camaraderie that once bound them to their allies was gone, replaced by a silence that felt heavier than words. To Loyalists, it was as though the lions had already withdrawn into a world of their own making, one no longer lit by the Emperor's light. A final whisper, recorded in the private journal of a guardsman, later executed for inciting defeatism, encapsulated the fear that gripped the barracks. They do not fight beside us anymore. They fight near us, yes, but not with us. And when the day comes that they turn, none of us will be able to say, "We did not hear it coming." The whispers were never meant to reach high command. They were fragments, carried on tired breaths, and passed between hands, polishing weapons. Yet even whispers can topple pillars, and in the shadow of the Lions of Helios, Loyalists already felt the ground shifting beneath their feet. On the morning of battle, the banners of a chapter are meant to rise before the sun itself, stitched by hands long dead, anointed with oils by generations of chaplains. They are not mere cloth. They are the soul of a chapter made visible, the oath of loyalty given form. To see them carried forward is to feel the Emperor's light descending upon the field. To see them unfurled is to remember why men march into death without fear. And so, when the banners of the Lions of Helios remained folded, Loyalists felt the absence like a blade twisting in the gut. The field was prepared. Voxes crackled with the low thunder of deployment orders. The Astra Militarum regiments stood ready in ranks, lasguns gleaming in the weak dawn light. Engines growled in the distance. The clatter of tracked vehicles punctuating the rhythm of soldiers marching to their staging grounds. All eyes turned, as they always did, to the fortress monastery where the lions gathered. They waited for the standard to rise above the battlements, to signal that faith itself was leading them into the teeth of the enemy. But the wall remained bare stone. At first, the Loyalists told themselves it was a delay. Perhaps a ritual ran longer. Perhaps the banner-bearer had not yet taken his station. But the moments dragged, and the air grew heavy with unease. When the lions finally emerged, their armor polished, their weapons primed, they came without their colors. They strode as warriors still, yet the absence of their banners hollowed the sight. To see a chapter without its standard was to see a blade without its edge, a flame without heat. The guardsmen whispered in their ranks. Commissars barked at them to silence, but they felt it too. The absence gnawed at the edges of discipline. The Iron Talon's chaplain, still a watchful shadow among them, clenched his Crozius until the haft groaned. He had seen banners torn apart in battle, yes, but never banners withheld by choice. To fold them away, to leave them untouched, was not simply a regular writ, was a wound inflicted upon the chapter's own soul. The lions marched forward, as if nothing were wrong. They spoke orders, they deployed in flawless formations, they opened fire with the precision that had once been their pride. And yet, to every loyalist present, the field was diminished. The banners were more than symbols. They were anchors of faith. Without them, every shout sounded thinner, every volley seemed hollow. Even victory would feel incomplete. Rumor took hold like infection. Some said the lions had hidden their banners because they no longer bore the Emperor's sigil, that the Aquila had been stripped or replaced. Others swore the banners had been defiled in some unseen ritual, folded away out of shame. A darker whisper claimed the lions had ceased to carry them because they no longer fought in his name at all, that their loyalty had shifted to another patron, whose colors could not yet be revealed. None of these whispers were spoken in open councils. None reached the ears of high command, for to repeat such accusations aloud was to risk immediate execution. But in the barracks, in the trenches, in the moments between battles, the word spread, and each repetition made the dread heavier. The men who looked to the Astartes for proof of divine will now found themselves asking questions they could not bear to answer. For the Astartes themselves, the absence of banners was not explained. Their captains gave orders as though nothing had changed. Their chaplain lead rites that seemed shorter, stripped of their former weight. None mentioned the banners. None spoke of why they did not rise. And in that silence, dread festered. A wound unacknowledged never heals. It only deepens. One guardsman, who dared to write what others only feared, captured the moment in his journal before the Inquisition burned it with his body, when the banners did not rise. It was as though the sun itself failed to climb the sky. We saw them fight, yes. We saw them bleed, yes. But we no longer saw the Emperor in them. We saw only men, armored and armed, but men who walked apart from us. And if their banners do not rise, how long before they themselves refuse to rise beside us? The absence of a banner seems small to those who do not understand the weight of symbols in the Imperium. To the uninitiated, it is cloth, nothing more. But to those who have fought, who have bled, who have whispered litanies to the fabric as if it were holy relic, the sight of it folded away is devastation. It is betrayal without declaration. denial without words. And it was in that absence that the Loyalists began to see truth. The Lions of Helios were no longer the brothers they had once been. For some, hope clung stubbornly. Perhaps it was a mistake. Perhaps the banners had been damaged beyond repair, awaiting consecration. Perhaps the Lions still held faith, but expressed it in ways unseen. Hope is the Imperium's most fragile weapon, and it clung to these excuses like a drowning man clings to driftwood. Yet, deep down, even those who whispered hope knew what they had seen. Banners left untouched were not accident. They were choice. The day ended in victory. The enemy was routed, their forces scattered to the winds. The Lions of Helios stood triumphant, their armor scorched, their weapons bloody. But as the soldiers of the Imperium raised their own tattered regimental standards, as they held high their battered flags and sang hymns of thanks to the throne, the Lions stood beneath empty air. Their victory was without color, their triumph without symbol, and in that hollow sky, rumor crystallized into dread. For once the banner does not rise, neither can the faith it represents. The rites of the Adeptus Astartes are older than most of the worlds they defend. Every gesture, every syllable, every drop of sacred oil carries centuries of meaning. To see them performed is to witness the continuity of faith, unbroken across 10,000 years of war. And yet, in the fortress monastery of the Lions of Helios, something vital had begun to slip. The ceremonies no longer resonated with the thunder of certainty. They faltered not in grand failures, but in subtle omissions that only the attentive noticed. For the Loyalists watching, those omissions weighed heavier than any open heresy. It began in the Apothecarium. After a brutal engagement, genocide vials were placed upon the altar, as was tradition. The chaplain should have traced the imperial aquila above each, invoking the emperor's name to sanctify what had been harvested from the fallen. But on that day, one vial remained uncrossed. The aquila was made upon the others, the words spoken as always, but that single vial was left untouched. No one mentioned it. The chaplain moved on, the brothers remained silent, and the ritual concluded as though nothing were amiss. Yet those who had witnessed Ita, an apothecary's assistant, a silent tech priest, even a commissar, granted rare entry knew what it meant. To leave the sign unmade was to leave the emperor uninvoked. The breach was small, but the Imperium understands better than any that faith is not measured in the size of its gestures, but in their completeness. One omission is enough to corrupt the whole. And so, while the Lions marched on, the silence spread. Other rites began to falter. The litanies before battle grew shorter, delivered in clipped tones without the fire of conviction. The hymns sung in the halls no longer carried harmony. Some voices trailed off before the final lines, as if unwilling to speak them. Loyalists who listened with sharpened ears heard the hesitation, the thinning of devotion that no blade could mend. Among the guardsmen, rumors grew like mold in damp air. Some claimed that the emperor's name, when spoken by the Lions, was faint, almost mumbled. Others said they had seen a marine bow during prayer, but without crossing his chest with the aquila. None of these things could be proven. Each was denied, dismissed as the mutterings of soldiers too long at war. But in their hearts, the Loyalists knew. These were not accidents. These were choices, deliberate and damning. The chaplain of the Iron Talons bore witness again, and his suspicion hardened into dread. He stood beside their chaplain during one of the great vigils, listening as the rites unfolded. The words were all present, yes, but they rang hollow. The cadence was wrong. When the emperor's name was invoked, it came softer than the rest, as though spoken from obligation rather than devotion. To speak his name faintly is worse than not, and all it is to admit that. His presence no longer ignites the soul. In the silence that followed, the Iron Talon found himself staring at the faces of the Lions. They were carved from stone, disciplined, perfect in their stillness. But it was the stillness of absence, not of reverence. Their eyes did not blaze with faith. They looked forward, unblinking, unbroken, but empty. The chaplain clenched his crozius, his knuckles white against the haft. He wanted to call them out, to thunder the accusation of heresy, but he knew what such words would unleash. To accuse an Astartes chapter without undeniable proof was to risk war within the crusade. And so he remained silent, though his silence was its own kind of complicity. The rites continued, but their cracks widened. A librarian failed to complete a benediction before battle, halting mid-phrase, as though his mind had drifted elsewhere. A captain, when asked to recite the words of remembrance for the fallen, gave them in full but without passion, his voice even cold, lifeless. The guardsmen who stood nearby shivered, as if a chill wind had passed through the hall. It was not what was missing that disturbed them, most it was the knowledge that the missing pieces would never return. In the barracks, the whispers turned sharper. "They don't finish their prayers anymore," one guardsman hissed. Another replied, "Then they are already finished." These words spread in secret, yet the effect was corrosive. Confidence in the lions dissolved. Trust, once unshakable, rotted beneath the weight of unfinished rites. To a soldier who relies on faith as much as rations, the sight of angels faltering was unbearable. Better to face an enemy's fire than the silence of doubt from one's protector. The lions themselves offered no defense. If they noticed the omissions, they gave no sign. If they felt the hollowing of their rites, they bore it with stoicism, neither denying nor correcting it. Perhaps they believed themselves unchanged, or perhaps they had already abandoned the need to pretend. Either way, the effect was the same. Every ceremony ended not in unity, but in silence. One loyalist officer, his name stricken from history when the Inquisition cleansed the record, wrote his last entry in a data slate before vanishing. "It is not heresy," shouted, "that destroys us. It is heresy," whispered, "heresy half-spoken, heresy left unsaid." When a rite is unfinished, it is not the ritual that fails, it's the soul behind it. And the lions of Helios have left something unfinished that cannot be repaired. The emperor's name was still spoken, but faintly. His Aquila was still traced, but not always upon every relic. The rites were still performed, but no longer whole. For the loyalists watching, the meaning was clear, though they dared not speak it aloud. Once a chapter's faith is fractured, it cannot be remade by ritual alone, and once the rites are left unfinished, they will never be finished again. It began, as true betrayal often does, in the quiet edges where no banners flew and no witness was expected. The war still raged at the front, where the Astra Militarum broke themselves against the enemy line, and the lions of Helios still marched with them. To the unknowing, all seemed as it ever had. Bolters roared, chainswords sang, and the emperor's foes were cast down in ruin. Yet, in the shadows of that battlefield, a different war stirred, one that was not fought against Xenos or heretic, but against the brothers who had once stood shoulder to shoulder. The first sign was a patrol that did not return. 5 guardsmen, led by a junior officer, had gone out with 2 lions of Helios to sweep the ruins of a man. Hours passed, then a day. The Vox crackled with static, but no voices. The commander sent another squad to investigate, this one accompanied by an iron-taloned sergeant. What they found was not what they had expected. The manufactorum was silent, its great machines long dead, their once mighty pistons frozen under centuries of rust. The dust was thick, the air tainted with the faint temps of promethium spills, long evaporated. Within those dark halls, the loyal squad found bodies. The guardsmen lay scattered, their throats torn out not by claws or alien blades, but by the unmistakable bite of chain. Their armor bore the marks of bolter rounds fired at point-blank range. There was no sign of the enemy. Only the lions of Helios were missing. The iron-taloned sergeant stood over the corpses, his hand tightening around his bolt pistol. He said nothing, but his silence was heavy. The guardsmen with him whispered among themselves, fear clawing at their throats. None dared name it betrayal aloud, but the truth was written in blood. Their supposed guardians had turned their blades on them, and no proclamation had accompanied the deed. No war cry, no renunciation of oaths, only violence in the dark, carried out with the precision of warriors who once swore to defend. When the report reached command, it was suppressed. The commissars knew what panic would spread if the truth were voiced openly. The bodies were burned, the logs sealed, the names of the dead struck from the day's tally. Officially, the patrol had fallen to enemy ambush. Unofficially, the Loyalists who had seen the wounds, who had heard the silence of the manufactorum, knew better. They carried the knowledge like a poison, eating at their faith. The pattern repeated itself. Patrols vanished. Squads sent to reconnoiter returned without their Astartes escorts. Vox channels crackled with half messages, cut off mid-sentence. Once, a guardsman's dying scream burst across the frequency, ending in silence, followed by the low, distorted growl of an Astartes voice, speaking words no one could decipher. The Inquisition would later purge those records, but at the time, the sound spread through the ranks like wildfire. The Lions of Helios were no longer protectors. They were predators stalking the periphery. Loyalists began to watch them differently. Where once their presence had inspired awe, now it inspired dread. Guardsmen found excuses to avoid patrols with them. Commissars tightened their grip on discipline, yet even they could not banish the suspicion that clung to every shadow. The chaplain of the Iron Talons kept his silence, but his eyes never left the lions when they moved, his Crozius always within reach. He, more than anyone, knew what had begun. The first blade turned is never a declaration, it is a test, a probing of boundaries, a measure of how much can be done before discovery becomes unavoidable. The lions did not strike in open defiance. They struck in silence, choosing moments where the Emperor's gaze seemed furthest, where the Loyalists were most vulnerable, and each time, their betrayal deepened. The guardsmen who survived began to whisper of the coldness in the lions' eyes, of the way they seemed to move apart from the others, as though no longer part of the same war. One soldier swore he had seen a lion watching him across the firelight, helm removed, expression unreadable, until the Marine turned away without a word. Another claimed he had caught the glint of a chainsword wet with blood, hastily cleaned before it could be seen by others. None of these stories could be proven, but together they built a picture darker than any official report. And then came the discovery that ended all denial. A loyal squad, searching the ruins of a hablock, found the missing lions. They had not vanished into the enemy's maw. They had not fallen in battle. They stood in the shadows of the collapsed building, their weapons drawn, their armor slick with fresh blood. Around them lay the corpses of guardsmen, their bodies arranged not as victims of battle, but as if placed deliberately, almost ritually. The lions did not flee when discovered. They did not explain. They simply turned and walked deeper into the ruins, their silence more damning than any spoken word. The loyal squad did not pursue. To confront them outright was to invite slaughter, and none had the strength to stand against Astartes warriors who had chosen betrayal. They returned, shaken, their reports hushed, their faces pale. They knew the first blade had been turned, and with it, the bond between brotherhoods had been severed forever. From that day on, no loyalist fought beside the lions without fear gnawing at their hearts. Every step taken near them felt like standing on the edge of an abyss. Every battle waged with them at one side carried the unspoken dread that the next turn of the blade might not strike a guardsman on patrol, but the entire host itself. The first blood had not been announced. It had been discovered, staining the shadows of a manufactorum and the silence of a chapter. Already lost, the war did not stop simply because trust had fractured. The campaigns ground on, the enemies of the Imperium still pressing with unrelenting force. The Lions of Helios still fought, their bolters thundering, their blades cutting swaths through foes that ordinary men could never hope to face. But to those loyalists who marched beside them, each moment became torment. Their guardians were now shadows, their brothers in arms now figures cast in suspicion. Every command carried the weight of a test. Every step alongside them felt like balancing on the knife edge of an abyss. When a captain of the Lions ordered a push into the ruins of a hive block, the guardsmen hesitated. It was not the danger that made them pause. They had long ago ceased to fear death. It was the question behind the command. Were they being led into battle or into slaughter? Was the ruin ahead filled with the Emperor's enemies? Or would it be the loyal themselves who fell beneath Astartes' blades in the dark? To obey meant risking betrayal. To resist meant defying angels of death, whose wrath could annihilate them in an instant. There was no safety in either choice. Kamisa's men, bred to embody iron certainty, felt the same gnawing fear. They hid it behind barked orders and summary executions of soldiers who voiced too much doubt. But in their hearts, the torment grew. How does one enforce faith in troops who have seen their protectors turn their weapons inward? How does one silence whispers when every whisper carries truth? They too walked the edge, knowing that to call out the Lions openly would ignite a war they could not hope to survive. Yet to say nothing was to allow the rot to spread unchecked. For the chaplain of the Iron Talons, the torment was sharper still. Each day he stood in their presence, Crozius in hand, watching them with eyes sharpened by suspicion. He longed to denounce them, to raise his voice in thunderous accusation, but he knew the truth. Without irrefutable proof, his words would carry no weight, and the Lions would cut him down for daring to speak them. He was forced to bear witness in silence, his very soul pulled taut between duty to the Emperor and survival in the shadow of heresy. The Loyalists who remained true began to live as if in two wars at once. On one front, they battled the enemies of mankind with all the fury their training could muster. On the other, they fought an invisible war of trust, of choice, of silence. A guardsman described it in a letter that would never reach home. The heretic's bullets are easier to face than a brother's eyes. At least the enemy is honest in their hate. At least the enemy does not pretend to pray while sharpening the knife behind their back. Each order from the Lions became a question in disguise. Advance, and perhaps survive. Retreat, and perhaps be branded coward or traitor. When they were told to hold a line, they did so knowing the Marines at their side might abandon them in the crucial moment or worse, turn their weapons inward. The abyss yawned with every command, and the Loyalists walked it step by step. Even in victory, there was no peace. When battles ended and the dead were counted, the rituals that followed only deepened the torment. The Lions prayed, yes, but faintly. They invoked the Emperor's name, but without fire. And for the Loyalists, forced to kneel beside them, the act became unbearable. They could not rise without wondering if their own faith had been tainted by proximity, if their prayers had been diminished by the hollow echoes of those who no longer believed. Faith was once a fortress. Now it felt like a mask, fragile and cracking. A commissar, hardened by decades of campaigns, found himself faltering as he wrote in his private record, "I cannot tell my men to trust what I myself no longer trust. Every order I give is a lie, and every silence I keep is treachery by omission. Yet if I speak, we are undone. The Lions have made of us liars, and there is no path back to truth." His words would be purged later, but the torment was real. The choice was not only whether to obey, but whether to endure. Some guardsmen deserted, slipping away into the ruins of war zones, where death might claim them, but not betrayal. Others hardened themselves into stone, following orders without thought, burying their doubt beneath layers of discipline until they became machines of war more than men. Still others turned inward, praying with a desperation that bordered on madness, begging the Emperor to intervene, to reveal whether those they marched beside were still his sons or already something else. The Lions, for their part, gave no answer. They fought with the same precision, gave commands with the same authority, moved through the ranks with the same silent menace. If they noticed the torment they caused, they did not acknowledge it. Perhaps they saw the Loyalists not as brothers anymore, but as tools, pawns in a greater game. Or perhaps they, too, wrestled with their own doubts, trapped between the oaths they had once sworn and the shadows they now embraced. None could say. What is known is this: the torment was not momentary. It stretched across campaigns, knowing at the hearts of all who served near them. Faith became fragile. Loyalty became a wound. The Loyalists lived in a state of constant testing, each choice heavy with consequence, each silence heavy with guilt. They stood beside warriors who once embodied the Emperor's will, and now embodied only uncertainty. For those who remained true, the Loyalists' choice was no choice at all. It was a slow crucifixion, a torment that bled them of certainty day by day. To follow was to risk betrayal. To resist was to invite destruction. And so they walked the edge of the abyss, knowing that one day soon, the ground beneath them would give way, and there would be no return. The fall of a chapter is never a single moment, never a single cry of heresy that severs oaths in an instant. It comes like rot creeping through wood, unseen until the beams can no longer hold their weight. So it was with the Lions of Helios. Their decline had been whispers, silences, absences, but whispers cannot last forever. Silence must one day break, and when it did, the sound was not the thunder of an external foe, but the clash of brothers within their own halls. The fortress monastery stood proud upon a jagged cliff, its towers carved with the sigils of victories past, its halls echoing with the voices of generations sworn to the Emperor's name. But those same stones that had once been consecrated by blood and prayer became an arena for betrayal. The first open fracture erupted deep within the vaults of the Reclusium, where rituals of devotion were meant to bind the chapter in unity. Instead, they tore it apart. It began with a chaplain who refused to kneel. His brethren had gathered for the rite of remembrance, the candles burning low, the genocide of the fallen displayed with solemn reverence. When the time came to bow heads and speak the Emperor's name, he remained upright, his eyes fixed not on the relics, but on his brothers. "Empty words," he said, his voice low, but the echo carried like a curse through the chamber. The silence that followed was more terrible than any battle cry. A sergeant struck him, demanding he repent. He did not. He drew his crozius, not in defense, but in defiance. The blow he delivered shattered more than Bonnet shattered the illusion that the lions were whole. Within the hour, the fortress monastery was divided. Brothers who had doubted in silence now spoke openly. Brothers who had prayed with trembling voices now prayed no longer. Yet among them were still those who remained true, who would rather die than forsake the throne. And so the chapter turned upon itself, not all at once, not with banners raised and declarations of rebellion, but with skirmishes in the corridors, duels in the training yards, executions carried out in the very cells where once captives had been held. The fortress became a maze of war. Bolter fire rattled through stone cloisters where litanies had once been sung. Chainswords screamed in the chapels, their teeth tearing apart not only flesh but the sanctity of holy ground. Blood ran across the mosaics, depicting the Emperor's triumphs, staining the stones that had sworn unity for centuries. The Loyalists within the Lions fought with desperation, but theirs was not the clean fury of war. It was the grief of men forced to slay those they once called brother. A captain loyal to Terra drove his blade through the chest of his own second-in-command, tears staining his eyes even as the traitor's lifeblood soaked his gauntlet. A squad barricaded themselves in the armory, defending relics of the chapter against their own kin, who sought to claim them for a cause unspoken. In each clash, the weight of betrayal pressed heavier than the violence itself. The Loyalists of the Astra Militarum, stationed outside the monastery, watched in dread as smoke rose from the towers. They could not intervene. To march inside was to invite certain death. to be crushed between two factions of Astartes, whose wrath would not distinguish ally from foe. All they could do was listen to the distant thunder of bolters and the screams that shook even the stone walls. They prayed, some desperately, that the Emperor would deliver judgment upon the traitors. But many knew that his judgment was already present, carved into the very sound of brothers killing brothers. The chaplain of the Iron Talons stood witness from afar. He knew what unfolded within could not be undone. Once a chapter drew blood against itself, the bond was beyond repair. He recorded the truth in his own logs, though he knew the Inquisition would purge them. The lions have torn themselves apart. They no longer need the enemy to strike them down. They have become their own ruin. The battles inside the monastery dragged on for days. Whole wings of the fortress changed hands multiple times, corridors becoming graves for those who had once shared victory feasts together. The librarians, their minds torn between duty and heresy, became weapons of psychic devastation, their powers cracking walls and shattering statues. The apothecaries who once preserved genocide now fought to deny it to their rivals, smashing vials rather than let them fall into hands they deemed corrupted. Every sanctum, every hall, became contested ground, and yet, even as war raged within, no one spoke aloud what they had become. The traitors did not proclaim themselves followers of chaos, nor did the Loyalists cry out with certainty that their brothers had turned to the dark gods. It was subtler, quieter, and in that quiet, all the more horrifying. It was not worship of the warp that had split them, was the withering of faith, the hollowing out of conviction. When belief is gone, no heretical banner is needed. A chapter can die simply by ceasing to be whole. By the time the echoes faded, the fortress monastery was a tomb. Its stones were blackened, its halls silent, save for the drip of blood seeping between cracks in the floor. Loyalists who survived staggered into the light, their armor scarred, their spirits broken. They did not speak. What could they say? That they had slain their brothers to keep faith, that they had fought not for victory, but for the right to still call themselves sons of the Emperor. The war within was not recorded in imperial annals. Official histories spoke only of the Lions of Helios' later fate, their name erased, their banners burned. But among the Loyalists who bore witness, the truth lived on. They remembered the sound of brothers turning upon brothers. They remembered blood staining the same stones that had sworn unity, and they knew what others could not. The fall of a chapter is not marked by the enemy's blade, but by the first time a brother turns his weapon inward. When the echoes of bolter fire finally faded, and the halls of the fortress monastery lay heavy with smoke and blood, the Imperium moved as it always does. The administratum scribes arrived with their data slates. The Inquisition dispatched its agents in silence, and the ecclesiarchy prepared its litanies of cleansing. The Lions of Helios no longer existed, not as a chapter, not as a name. What had taken centuries to build, what had been etched in honor upon hundreds of worlds, was struck out in the space of a single decree. The parchment of their history was burned, their banners reduced to ash, their symbols scoured from armor and stone alike. What had been their fortress was sealed, its doors locked with purity seals that would never be broken again. It was a ritual as old as betrayal itself. The Imperium does not tolerate memory of the fallen, for memory can become worship, and worship can turn to heresy. Better to salt the wound, to erase the name entirely, to make it as though the chapter had never been. The scribes rewrote the records of campaigns where the Lions had fought. Their deeds were reassigned to other chapters, or to faceless Astartes detachments. Statues of their captains were pulled down from plazas. Their victories were recited no more. The galaxy would move forward, as though they had never drawn breath. And yet, the Loyalists who had marched beside them could not forget. They carried memories sharper than any decree could erase. A guardsman who had once prayed beside a lion in the ruins of a hive city still remembered the marine's voice. the resonance of a litany spoken with fire that had since burned out. A commissar who had enforced discipline among troops under their shadow remembered the cold silence in their eyes as faith drained from them. A chaplain of the Iron Talons remembered the hollow ring of rites left unfinished. The first blade turned in silence, the war within their halls. These memories clung like scars. No decree could burn them away. The Loyalists did not remember the Lions of Helios as a name. They remembered them as faces. Brothers once trusted, once revered, whose betrayal had been all the sharper because of the devotion they had once embodied. To erase the name was one thing. To erase the faces from memory was impossible. In mess halls across regiments, soldiers spoke in whispers of the Marine who had looked away during the oath, of the captain who had ordered them into the abyss with a voice stripped of conviction, of the chaplain who refused to kneel. They did not use the name of the chapter, for that name was forbidden, but they spoke of men, of moments, of the shadows they had seen, and in those stories, the erased name lingered, as stubborn as a stain. The Inquisition worked tirelessly to silence such memories. Witnesses were purged, regiments reassigned, logs scoured. A guardsman who wrote of the chapter in his journal was executed for incitement to defeatism. A Vox officer who stored the corrupted transmissions on his slate was burned alive as a warning. Even entire companies were redeployed to distant war zones, their veterans scattered across 1,000 fronts to ensure no single voice might unite the whispers. But memory is a kind of rebellion the Imperium cannot fully kill, for those who had seen betrayal firsthand. Forgetting was not obedience, it was death of a different kind, and so the memories remained. In the silence between campaigns, they surfaced like ghosts. Soldiers told one another of the patrols that never returned, of the banners that never rose, of the rites left unfinished. They did not speak the name Lions of Helios, for that name no longer existed, but they spoke of the brothers who walked away, the angels who would not kneel, the banners folded in shame. These were the shapes the erased name took, fragments of truth wrapped in metaphor, echoes that could not be burned with parchment. Among the Astartes themselves, silence was heavier still. Other chapters who had fought beside the lions did not mention them in councils, but their chaplains carried the memory like lead in their souls. To see a chapter fall is to confront a reflection too sharp to bear. They knew that what had consumed the lions could consume any of them. Faith is not steel, it can crack. Oaths are not unbreakable, they can fray. And in the quiet of their sanctums, they whispered prayers that the Emperor would preserve them from the same fate, even as doubt gnawed at the edges of certainty. For the Imperium, erasure was victory. The name was gone, the banners were ash. The fortress monastery stood silent, its stones sealed against intrusion. Official records spoke nothing of betrayal. The galaxy, to the scribe's eye, was cleansed. But for the Loyalists who had seen the truth, the erasure was its own cruelty. To deny the name was to deny their own suffering, to deny the scars carved into their faith. They had not merely lost brothers, they had lost the right to speak of them. One guardsman, long after the campaign, dared to write upon a wall, in blood, "I remember their eyes." He was executed within the hour. But his words spoke what countless others carried silently. They remembered, not the name, for that was forbidden, not the banners, for those had been burned. They remembered the faces. They remembered the betrayal. They remembered what it meant to stand beside warriors who had looked away from the throne. The Imperium can erase names, can strike banners from record, can scour histories with fire and decree, but it cannot command the heart to forget what it has witnessed. And so the name that was erased lives on, not in the annals of Terra, but in the haunted silence of Loyalists who carry the weight of memory. For them, the Lions of Helios still march in whispers, in scars, in the faces of brothers now nameless, but never truly gone. War in the Imperium is endless. Campaign bleeds into campaign, system after system swallowed by fire. Soldiers marched from one battlefield to the next until their lives blur into one long litany of blood. For most, the horrors of one war are eventually drowned by the horrors of another. But for those who survived the fall of the Lions of Helios, memory never faded. Every battlefield after was colored by what they had seen. The enemy's cruelty could be endured. The Xenos' savagery could be explained. Even the unending hunger of chaos could be named, cursed, fought against. But betrayal from within the sight of faith, hollowing oaths dissolving. Brothers turning against brothers was something that clung like shadow. It was a scar that no new wound could cover. A guardsman who had once marched in the shadow of the lions fought later on Armageddon, where orc warbands flooded the ash wastes in endless tides. His comrades marveled at his bravery, how he did not flinch when the green tide thundered toward the trenches. Yet in truth, it was not courage, but numbness. He had already seen worse. He had seen angels of the Emperor falter. He had seen warriors blessed by the gene seed of gods fall into silence and betrayal. What threat could an orc pose compared to that? Every battle after was simply an echo of the one that had already broken him. Kamisas, too, bore the echo. Men once unshakable in their certainty found themselves hesitating before giving commands. They wondered if their soldiers saw the same faltering in them that they themselves had once seen in the lions. They enforced faith with the same iron rituals. But at night, in private, they questioned the worth of their own words. They had witnessed devotion fail. They had seen the hollowness behind the mask of discipline, and once you have seen it, you cannot unsee it. The chaplain of the Iron Talons carried the heaviest burden of all. He returned to his chapter, bearing no accusation, for the Inquisition had already cleansed the record. Officially, nothing had happened. Yet, he carried it in his soul. The memory of unfinished rites, of banners folded away, of brothers drawing blades against one another in holy halls. Each time he raised his Crozius thereafter, each time he thundered the Emperor's name, he wondered if his own voice would one day falter. He knew, as no outsider could, that faith is not indestructible. He had seen it die, and in seeing, he had learned a truth that most of the Imperium must never know. Even the Emperor's angels can fall, without ever declaring it. The echo spread further than those who had been present. Whispers survive longer than decrees. Regiments scattered across the galaxy carried fragments of the story, spoken in shadows, never in councils. They spoke of brothers who did not finish their prayers, of banners that never rose, of names erased but not forgotten. These whispers bled into other war zones, shaping the way soldiers looked at their Astartes guardians. For most, faith in the Space Marines remained unshaken, but for those who had heard the whispers, doubt lingered at the edge of every prayer. If one chapter could fall in silence, why not another? If the Lions of Helios could betray their oaths without raising a cry, what prevented any other from doing the same? The Imperium cannot erase such echoes. It can burn records, destroy monuments, purge witnesses, but it cannot silence memory. Memory is stubborn. Memory clings to the soul long after parchment has turned to ash. And so the survivors lived with it, not as story, not as heresy, but as a shadow behind every act of devotion. When they knelt in prayer, they remembered Marines who once prayed faintly. When they obeyed orders, they remembered voices stripped of conviction. When they saw banners rise, they remembered the day banners did not. For them, loyalty became sharper, but also heavier. They clung to the Emperor with desperation, knowing how easily oaths can crumble. They fought with more ferocity, not because they believed more, but because they knew belief could die. In their eyes, every battlefield was haunted, not by the enemy, but by the faces of brothers now erased, whose absence was louder than any hymn. A veteran of those days, when asked in secret what it meant to survive such a fall, answered only this: "It means you never trust the silence again." He meant the silence in prayers, the silence in oaths, the silence in the hearts of those who claim loyalty. He meant the silence that had once crept into the lions of Helios, unnoticed until it was too late. That silence followed him into every war thereafter. It followed all of them. The Imperium believes it can erase shame by erasing names. But names are the least of what lingers. The echo of betrayal cannot be scoured by decree. It lives in the memory of those who saw, in the scars of those who endured, in the unease of those who whisper. And though the lions of Helios are gone, their banners burned, their records rewritten, their name forbidden, they remain. They remain in the way survivors pray louder, fight harder, doubt deeper. They remain in the suspicion that flickers whenever loyalty is tested. They remain in the quiet knowledge that even angels can fall without fanfare. The Loyalists who survived never told their stories in full. They knew the penalty for speaking forbidden truths, but they did not need to. Every battlefield after carried the weight of what they had seen. Every oath sworn rang with the question of whether it would hold. And so they lived, and so they died, carrying not only the Emperor's name, but also the echo of the chapter that had turned away. That echo remains still. It hums beneath the surface of the Imperium, a ghost in the prayers of soldiers, a shadow in the litanies of chaplains, a question in the silence of the faithful. The lions of Helios are gone, but their fall lives on in those who cannot forget. The Imperium will never speak of them again. Their banners are ash, their fortress a tomb, their names struck from every record. Yet the silence they left behind cannot be erased. For those who survived, it lingers in every oath, in every prayer, in every battlefield where faith is tested. They know what it means to watch angels fall, to see devotion wither into doubt, to hear the hollow ring of loyalty breaking from within. The lions of Helios no longer march, but their shadow does, following every loyalist who remembers. And in that shadow lies the quiet truth the Imperium dares not admit. Some echoes never die.